Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century. So sit back as we go to a cold winter night in a West Virginia asylum. In a building that housed thousands of those deemed lunatics, screams in the dark were considered normal, but tonight would prove to be different. A nurse vanished without a trace during her night shift, leaving behind no clues. In an overcrowded institution where violence was routine, the question then arose, was the real monster a patient, or someone else entirely? To fully comprehend the environment that allowed such a sinister mystery to unfold in West Virginia, it is necessary to first examine the grim origins of the institutional system in the United States. In the winter of 1842, the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum officially opened its doors, heralded by politicians and medical professionals alike as a monumental achievement in public health. During this period, the establishment of such expansive facilities was publicly presented as a highly humane alternative to the traditional practice of confining the mentally ill in local prisons, workhouses, or even the basements of their own families. However, beneath this carefully constructed veneer of medical advancement, a deeply troubling and fatal reality began to take shape almost immediately upon the arrival of the very first patients. The institution, which had been explicitly intended to serve as a place of refuge, treatment, and eventual recovery, quickly proved to be a landscape of despair. Official medical records from the earliest operational days of the asylum reveal a staggering and horrific mortality rate that defies any acceptable standard of care, even for the 19th century. It was documented that out of the first 50 patients who were admitted into the care of the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum, an astonishing 29 individuals died shortly after their arrival. Such a dramatic and sudden loss of life within a newly established medical facility would, under any normal circumstances, spark widespread public outrage and demand an immediate, rigorous inquiry. Yet, in the context of the mid-19th century, the sudden deaths of those deemed to be lunatics were met with a profound and unsettling silence. There were absolutely no criminal investigations initiated to determine why more than half of the initial patient population had perished so rapidly within the asylum's walls. Law enforcement officials did not intervene, and local magistrates showed no interest in questioning the administration or the medical attendants. The individuals who died were frequently the poorest members of society, immigrants, or those who had been entirely abandoned by their relatives, meaning there was no external pressure from families or the press to advocate for their justice or to scrutinize the conditions of their confinement. When legal and administrative procedures required official documentation to close the files on these deceased individuals, the medical examiners and asylum directors relied upon highly questionable, unscientific explanations. Autopsy reports and official death certificates from the institution utilized vague and entirely fabricated medical terminology to mask what were likely deaths caused by severe neglect, malnutrition, or outright physical abuse. Medical attendants would formally record that a patient had unfortunately succumbed to obscure conditions such as maniacal exhaustion or general paralysis. These abstract terms provided a convenient and impenetrable legal shield, completely absolving the institution, its doctors, and its wardens of any responsibility or suspicion of foul play. This systematic administrative cover-up reflected a chilling truth about the era's approach to psychiatric care. The absolute indifference demonstrated by both the medical fraternity and the legal community meant that the moment a person crossed the threshold of the asylum, they were effectively stripped of their personhood and their basic human rights. Their lives were considered entirely expendable by the society that had locked them away, and their tragic deaths were treated as nothing more than clerical footnotes, swiftly filed away in the archives and deliberately forgotten. If this profound level of fatal neglect and unchecked authority was the accepted standard of care in a newly opened facility housing only a handful of inmates, one must carefully consider the terrifying implications of the decades to follow. As the century progressed and the nationwide demand for such institutions grew exponentially, these isolated asylums were pushed far beyond their architectural and medical limits. However, the grim pattern had already been set in stone, raising a deeply unsettling question. What would happen when these isolated facilities, already operating without oversight or empathy, became dangerously and uncontrollably overcrowded? By the time the year 1864 arrived, the institutional model had firmly taken root in Weston, West Virginia, culminating in the grand opening of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Conceived as a monument to modern psychiatric ambition, the colossal Gothic structure was originally designed with the strict intention of comfortably accommodating exactly 250 patients. Its architects had meticulously planned for spacious wards, high ceilings, and abundant natural light, firmly believing that a serene and highly ordered environment would naturally cure the afflictions of the mind. At the time of its inauguration, it was proudly presented to the public and the press as a shining beacon of medical progress, standing in stark contrast to the dark, unmonitored facilities of the previous decades. However, the lofty therapeutic ideals that laid the foundation of the institution were rapidly dismantled by the grim realities of a changing society. As local authorities, exhausted workhouses, and desperate families increasingly utilized the facility as a convenient dumping ground for anyone deemed socially undesirable, the population within the cold stone walls began to swell at an alarming rate. What had been carefully engineered as a quiet sanctuary for 250 souls soon saw its population explode to an unmanageable and staggering 2,400 patients. The sprawling asylum, once celebrated for its healing architecture, was swiftly transformed into a vast, inescapable warehouse for the forgotten. The living conditions inside the facility deteriorated into a state of absolute horror as the immense overcrowding took a heavy toll on both the physical infrastructure and the severely burdened staff. Patients were routinely crammed into freezing hallways, forced to sleep on bare, filthy floors shoulder to shoulder, while the heavily outnumbered medical attendants struggled merely to maintain the most basic semblance of physical order. With hundreds of severely unstable individuals packed into tight, claustrophobic quarters, uncontrollable violence became a daily and entirely expected occurrence. Brutal physical altercations erupted constantly among the inmates, and the overwhelmed, exhausted staff frequently resorted to excessive force, heavy restraints, or prolonged solitary confinement just to survive their grueling shifts. This tragic descent into institutional madness fostered a chaotic, profoundly lawless environment where the fundamental boundaries of safety and morality were entirely erased. The sheer scale of the misery meant that a sudden disappearance, a violent physical outburst, or even a sudden death could easily be swallowed by the relentless, deafening noise of the overcrowded wards. It was precisely within this labyrinth of stone and suffering, where desperation hung thick in the air and daily screams echoed unanswered through the long corridors, that the perfect shadowed stage was set. In such a deeply fractured ecosystem, a horrific and deliberate crime could easily unfold and go entirely unnoticed, waiting in the dark until it was far too late to save the victim. The duties of a night nurse at the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum were fraught with constant peril and immense psychological strain. As the sun set over the sprawling facility, the already chaotic atmosphere descended into an eerie, unpredictable darkness. A single nurse, armed with nothing more than a heavy ring of iron keys and a dim kerosene lantern, would be tasked with overseeing hundreds of restless, deeply disturbed patients. The corridors, originally designed for tranquil walks, were lined with sleeping mats and overcrowded beds, requiring the staff to carefully navigate through a maze of bodies while ignoring the incessant murmurs, sudden screams, and rattling of heavy wooden doors that echoed through the cold stone halls throughout the long night. It was during one of these grueling shifts, on a particularly bitter winter evening, that a young nurse began her standard rounds through one of the most densely populated wings of the asylum. Her colleagues noted that her demeanor was no different from any other night, as she signed the registry and collected her lantern. She was last observed by a fellow attendant just past midnight, her solitary figure casting long shadows against the peeling paint of the corridor walls as she walked toward a secluded ward to dispense medication. The heavy iron door clicked shut behind her, marking the final time anyone would ever report seeing her alive. When the harsh morning light finally broke across the asylum grounds, and the day staff arrived to relieve the exhausted night workers, the young nurse failed to report to the administration desk to sign out. At first, her absence was dismissed as a simple oversight, perhaps a sign of extreme fatigue that had led her to retreat directly to her sleeping quarters without completing the formal paperwork. However, as the morning progressed into the afternoon and her personal belongings were found untouched in the staff break room, a deep sense of unease began to settle over the facility. The realization quickly set in that she had simply vanished without a trace somewhere within the sprawling, heavily locked complex. A search was hastily organized, but the sheer scale of the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum rendered the effort almost entirely futile from the very beginning. Navigating a gargantuan, Gothic structure composed of miles of dimly lit corridors, hidden basement levels, and countless locked rooms was an impossible task, made even more daunting by the presence of 2,400 unpredictable patients. The search party attempted to interrogate the inmates who resided in the ward where she was last seen, but the testimonies they gathered were largely incoherent, contradictory, or deeply influenced by the patient's severe mental afflictions, providing no solid leads for the frustrated staff. Faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation and the terrifying prospect of a public scandal, the asylum administration chose to take the path of least resistance. Rather than alerting local law enforcement or initiating a formal criminal inquiry, the hospital directors quietly concluded that the severe stress of the job had simply broken the young woman's resolve. They officially recorded her sudden departure as a voluntary abandonment of her post, pushing the narrative that she had slipped out into the cold night to escape the horrors of her employment and start a new life elsewhere. The search was abruptly called off, and the institution aggressively moved to sweep the entire incident under the rug, prioritizing their fragile reputation over the safety of their staff. However, the hasty assumption that she had merely abandoned her duties provided a convenient excuse that completely ignored the dark reality of the asylum's environment. The truth of what was actually happening behind those locked iron doors was far more sinister than a simple runaway case. To fully comprehend the deeply entrenched culture of violence that permeated these institutions, one must look beyond the official reports and examine the accounts of those who witnessed it firsthand. In the autumn of 1887, a pioneering investigative journalist named Nellie Bly deliberately feigned insanity to gain admission into the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York. Her objective was to uncover the hidden realities of psychiatric care, but what she ultimately exposed was a systematic nightmare orchestrated by the very individuals hired to provide medical comfort. Once inside the heavily guarded walls, Bly discovered a terrifying truth regarding the demographics of the patient population. Many of the women confined alongside her were not suffering from any form of mental illness whatsoever. Instead, they were perfectly sane immigrant women who had been hastily condemned to the asylum simply because they could not speak English or adequately defend themselves in a local courtroom. Stripped of their voices and isolated from their families, these vulnerable women were left entirely at the mercy of a profoundly corrupt medical staff, trapped in a legal and medical limbo from which there was seemingly no escape. The treatment administered by the nurses and attendants was characterized by an astonishing level of cruelty rather than any genuine attempt at medical rehabilitation. Bly meticulously documented incidents where patients were routinely choked, brutally beaten, and subjected to relentless psychological torment for the slightest infractions. One of the most horrifying practices involved forcing the women into freezing ice baths during the dead of winter, a punishment that routinely pushed already fragile individuals to the brink of physical collapse. The attendants, far from being caregivers, operated with absolute impunity, treating their charges with a level of brutality that defied all medical ethics and basic human decency. Unsurprisingly, this relentless regime of physical abuse frequently resulted in severe injuries and fatalities among the inmate population. However, the internal mechanisms of the asylum were expertly designed to protect the institution rather than the patients. When a woman tragically succumbed to the injuries inflicted by a violent nurse or died from extreme exposure after a forced ice bath, the medical administration would rapidly intervene to conceal the crime. Official death certificates were routinely falsified, and the demise of an abused patient was casually recorded in the hospital registry as being the result of natural causes or underlying physical ailments, effectively burying the truth alongside the victims. The harrowing revelations brought forth by Nellie Bly's investigation shattered the public illusion of the benevolent asylum, proving that the greatest threat within those stone walls was often the medical staff itself. When one applies this grim historical context to the sudden disappearance at the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum, the narrative takes on a far more sinister dimension. Knowing the extreme violence that nurses of this era were fully capable of inflicting, and the ease with which medical administrations covered up their crimes, a chilling new possibility emerged. The question then arose: was the missing night nurse truly the unfortunate victim of an unpredictable patient, or had she witnessed a crime she was not supposed to see, ultimately falling prey to her own colleagues? For 2 entire months following the abrupt disappearance of the night nurse, the administration at the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum maintained their highly convenient narrative. The harsh winter slowly gave way to a damp spring, and the overwhelming daily chaos of managing 2,400 deeply troubled patients quickly overshadowed any lingering questions about her sudden absence. However, as the weeks progressed, a deeply unsettling development began to steadily unfold within one of the older, structurally isolated wings of the massive Gothic building. A foul and unmistakable odor began to seep from the edges of a heavy iron door that led to a sealed-off, abandoned staircase. Initially, the overworked and exhausted staff dismissed the terrible stench as the natural result of a dead rodent or a severe failure in the asylum's archaic plumbing system. But as the days passed, the sickening scent of decay became entirely overpowering, eventually forcing the reluctant administration to investigate the forgotten corridor. When a maintenance crew finally forced open the rusted locks and descended into the suffocating, unventilated darkness of the stairwell, their flickering lanterns illuminated a truly horrifying scene. Lying in a crumpled, unnatural heap at the very bottom of the steep stone steps was the heavily decomposed body of the young night nurse who had vanished without a trace exactly 2 months prior. The physical state of her remains, severely ravaged by time and the damp, dark conditions of the isolated shaft, made it immediately apparent that she had not voluntarily fled the institution to start a new life. Instead, she had met a violent and terrifying end within the very walls where she had been employed, her body deliberately dragged and hidden away in a dark corner of the asylum where it was never meant to be discovered. The gruesome discovery naturally demanded immediate answers, but the ensuing investigation was severely crippled from the very beginning by both the limitations of 19th century forensic science and the deliberate opacity of the asylum's administration. Because the body had been left to decompose in a sealed shaft for such an extended period, any crucial physical evidence that might have pointed to a specific cause of death, such as defensive wounds, blunt force trauma, or signs of strangulation, had been completely eradicated by the passage of time. The local police, entirely unequipped to process a complex crime scene inside a medical fortress housing thousands of unpredictable suspects, were completely unable to determine the actual sequence of events. Law enforcement officials could not definitively prove whether the nurse had been violently ambushed and pushed down the dark steps by a severely unmedicated patient wandering the lawless halls, or if a far more sinister and calculated scenario had actually played out. Given the deeply entrenched culture of staff brutality and systemic abuse that heavily plagued these Victorian institutions, a deeply disturbing theory quickly emerged. Many could not help but wonder if the young nurse had witnessed a horrific abuse of power by her fellow attendants, perhaps an assault or a murder of a patient, and was subsequently silenced by her own colleagues, who then deliberately locked her body away to protect their dark, shared secrets. Despite the glaring physical inconsistencies of the crime scene, most notably the sheer impossibility of a victim accidentally locking a heavy iron door from the outside after falling down a flight of stairs, the institutional machinery moved swiftly and aggressively to protect its own the arrest of a medical professional, or the public admission of a severe fatal security breach, would have caused great excitement and outrage in the surrounding town, inevitably drawing unwanted government scrutiny to the dangerously overcrowded facility. To avoid this entirely, the hospital directors, much like the administrators at the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum decades prior, demonstrated an absolute and chilling indifference toward uncovering the actual truth of the matter. The official inquiry was superficial at best, ending rapidly with the administration hastily concluding that the nurse's demise was merely the result of a tragic, unseen accident in the dark. No formal criminal charges were ever laid against any patients or staff members, and no rigorous, private interrogations of the medical attendants were ever conducted. The horrifying case of the murdered night nurse was abruptly closed by the authorities, swept away just as easily as the initial, false reports of her voluntary disappearance. Ultimately, her tragic death became just another dark, unresolved secret swallowed by the towering stone walls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, leaving behind no justice and serving as a chilling testament to an era where the truth could easily be buried alongside the forgotten dead. To truly understand the devastating scale of this institutional indifference, one must look further north to the Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane, which opened its doors in New York in 1869. Here, the tragic reality of these forgotten souls is laid bare in a sprawling cemetery containing a staggering 5,776 unmarked graves. When patients died under mysterious conditions, or were simply abandoned by their families to succumb to illness, they were buried without an identity. Instead, their bodies were committed to the earth, marked only by a simple metal number tag pushed into the soil. This cold, administrative practice not only stripped them of their final shreds of humanity, but effectively erased any forensic evidence of foul play or systemic abuse. Ultimately, stepping through the heavy doors of a Victorian asylum meant being entirely erased from the world, leaving behind no history, no justice, and no voice. What are your thoughts on the justice system of the Victorian era? Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.